All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us for this presentation from our friends at Missouri River Bird Observatory. My name is Brooke Widmar. I'm with the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and I'll introduce our guests today and then let them get their show on the road. So first off, we have Ethan Duke. He's from the northeast side of the country, and after a term in the U.S. Air Force, he completed a degree in wildlife management from the State University of New York, Cobleskill. He spent several years studying Cerulean Warblers in the Cumberland Mountains of Tennessee before coming to Missouri in 2009. Dana Ripper is a wildlife ecologist who focuses on birds and their conservation. She has a master's in ecology from Arkansas State University and worked in conservation projects in 10 different states before making Missouri her home. In 2010, Dana and Ethan founded the Missouri River Bird Observatory. This organization is based in Arrow Rock, Missouri. They conduct research, avian population monitoring, youth education, community outreach, and policy advocacy. They're great partners with the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and we're really thrilled to have them give this webinar now. So I'll turn it over to them, and you guys can take it away. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Brooke, and Carol as well, just the folks at the Missouri Prairie Foundation. We really love working with you, and we're really excited to be here this afternoon to talk about sparrows. So this is a group of birds that a lot of folks find really, really challenging as far as ID is concerned. And hopefully by the end of our discussion today, you'll find them maybe a little less challenging and a little more interesting and exciting. So this is one of my very, very favorite groups of birds. Part of it was because when I first started identifying birds, it was one of the more challenging groups. And I feel that once you really get to know them, there's sort of a sense of accomplishment that goes along with being able to ID these little guys. So I do want to say that, you know, a lot of folks really kind of put pressure on themselves regarding bird ID, particularly little brown birds. And then it gets really frustrating. So don't ever let yourself get frustrated. These birds are beautiful when you get a good look at them. They're ecologically important. Some of them are of conservation concern. Many of them rely on our native prairie habitat, such as that provided by MPF. And so there's a lot of interesting things about them, aside from just identification. We're going to talk quite a lot about ID today, but also just tell y'all some of their natural history and even just some anecdotes from enjoying sparrows in Missouri and eastern Kansas. So let's see. As webinar attendees, I believe that you are all going to be able to put comments or questions into the chat function or the Q&A. It kind of is different depending on where those things are on your screen, but in my next slide here, I just am curious if you feel like it, put in the chat, just say yes or no, if you have heard either of the birds that I'm about to play, if you have heard their vocalizations before, and it might be just in your own backyard. So there's one of them. And here's the second one. So they kind of start off the same, right? And we're gonna leave those for later. I see some red bubbles coming up in the chat. It looks like 30 or 40 people even are putting in the chat that they may have heard those particular sparrows before.
There may be some questions about the second one.
Yes, we will get to it.
In the first one.
Excellent, excellent. And as far as their vocalizations are concerned, those songs to me start out very, very similar with a couple whistles, but then they sort of diverge from there. So yeah, we're gonna leave that mystery for a second. We will definitely get back to those and we'll actually show you photo of the bird along with the vocalizations. So there are 19 sparrow species that occur regularly in Missouri. There are others that are vagrants or rarities. And we're not just going to go through every single one of the sparrow species today, but we do want to sort of focus on getting a close-up view of them and really examining some of their differences and also where they live and what their habits are. So here's just some of them.
Yeah, this is a great montage for people to look at here because it really sure shows that breadth of different ones. And also, I mean, just think these are just sparrows. And I noticed that like the state ornithologist, Sarah Kendrick's on this too. And she lives by this mantra that birds are awesome. And now if you accept that and understand that and believe that, and you look at sparrows, of course, they must, living by that rule, they must be awesome as well. So whether it's a size thing, because there's a range of sizes, whether it's their colors, whether it's their behaviors, there's just an amazing world just within this. I think this slide that Dana put together really captures a lot of those differences too.
So here's some things to consider. We're going to be basically just showing folks a lot of pictures today and talking about a lot of what we'll speak about is the really ornate markings in sparrows that are so crucial to their ID and I think are just so incredibly enjoyable from an aesthetic standpoint as well. But some other things to consider, whether you're thinking about the ecology of these species or you are needing some more ID help. So say that you're looking at a bird or you've looked at the bird and you're kind of flipping through your field guide or your phone app and you're trying to figure it out. And there might be a couple species that look really similarly. You're not sure. Some of the other things to consider are their habitat, which is obviously super important to their ecology, but also it can at times help you with your identification as well. So we have sparrows that are prairie obligates, and if you are looking at a sparrow in a forest, it would be very unlikely that it would be one of those prairie obligates. Another thing to consider, and this is largely about winter sparrows, since we're right on the cusp of winter here, is their timing, their seasonality. Do they just breed here, just winter here? Do they just migrate through here? Behavior can sometimes be a really good cue, of course, for sort of observing, their life history and their ecology, but also as far as identification is concerned as well. And then we're not going to get super into vocalizations today. That is an entire area of study all of its own. But one thing that I found very nice as far as identifying sparrows is while at first glance or from far away, they might look quite similar to each other, a lot of them, their vocalizations are really very distinct and unique. Okay, so this is from the American Birding Association. And when I first saw this, I didn't think it was a joke exactly, but I just honestly thought it was a cute representation that was meant to be, amusing and interesting. But this actually is a very accurate chart in terms of the differences in the head markings and coloration. And I'm not asking anyone to, really examine this and learn all this right now. But you can see it's just it's a bit of a artistic exaggeration of all of the different field marks that you can find on sparrows' heads. And those are very, very important things to look at, as we will see. So this nice graphic here shows, it really, really pinpoints some of the things that you want to be looking at as you're looking at your sparrow. I know that it's quite easy to look at a sparrow and think, oh, a little brown bird, sparrow. But this, I think, nicely points out some of the field marks or identification characteristics that you really want to be honing in on when you're looking at a sparrow in order to ID it. So, you can see down on the bottom, slim for a sparrow with a moderately long tail. So basically the metrics, the overall measurements of the bird is something to look at. This is pointing out the dark spot in the center of this bird's chest. Bill color can be really quite important, as we'll see a couple examples of. And then again, the head patterns, the markings and patterns on the head, and wings. You can see this is pointing out some white wing bars. So we'll look at some of these things on a number of different sparrows. We are not going to talk about this little devil up here. This is the house sparrow. So I know this is one that folks are probably quite familiar with. This is going to be, I was going to say mostly urban and suburban areas, but we do get them sometimes in our own backyard here in rural Missouri. So this is an incredibly widespread, ubiquitous, introduced species, the English house sparrow. There is a story that I believed for many, many years was historically accurate. And that was that an individual, or excuse me, a society released English house sparrows and other birds on purpose because they wanted to have every avian species that was represented in Shakespeare's sonnets be present in the United States. That is not exactly historically accurate, although the grain of truth of the story is that there was a gentleman in New York who actually introduced house sparrows in order to help control the invasive, and also introduced non-native linden moth that was decimating trees in the East. And it was one of many, human experiments where we thought that if we introduced the natural predator of that non-native species, that it would turn out well, and it really didn't. That gentleman later was one of the founders of the Acclimatization Society, which had the mission of introducing plants and animals from the old world that would be interesting or useful or aesthetically pleasing. And luckily for us ecologically, a lot of the introductions that society undertook did not make it the way that house sparrows, or you can see down here, don't even mention the 220 million starlings, same guy. So they also introduced the European starling. So native sparrows particularly. So this is often the view that one might get of a sparrow, right? Pretty far away. Unless you have a feeder that's fairly near your house, to which quite a few species of sparrow might come, you're probably going to want to always have your binoculars when you're looking at sparrows. They can be fairly skulky. There's certainly the, I think of it as a meme, basically amongst birders. It's always the small brown bird that's flying away from one grass clump to another, or always behind the tree. So they can do that. They can skulk around. They can give you a really good view as well, though. But if you have binoculars or a camera or even a video camera, you're obviously going to be able to get a much better close-up view of them. So you can see that if you get this magnified, you're going to definitely be able to see more of the really important field marks than you can with them far away. So this is about winter sparrows, but just briefly, partially because we work on a lot of prairies, on grassland birds, prairie birds, and work with the Missouri Prairie Foundation on these species. But also, I think it's important to note that in many cases, our wonderful natural areas in Missouri, whether that's a Missouri Prairie Foundation property, or whether it's a Department of Conservation property, or Missouri State Park, or private property, the excellent habitat that Missouri land stewards provide for our birds in the summer then becomes really, really important wintering and migration habitat as well.
Yeah, those two particular sparrows there, the Henslow sparrow and the grasshopper sparrow in the same genus, Ammodramus. So they're very similar in shape. They have that big chunky head, and they're really grassland obligates. And they both are, although they're very similar, they do prefer a different structure. And so, as whether it's Jared out there trying to maintain prairies for the Prairie Foundation, they're hoping that their processes help with providing that kind of structure that the birds key in. into. And so like the Henslow sparrows like it a little bit thicker, and the grasshoppers like it a little bit thinner. And so they can use the same site, but they might want different structures within it. And if you have heterogeneity, you can have both of them coexisting. Um, so not necessarily saying that happened all the time historically on a landscape, but that's the best thing we can do. And oftentimes people say properly that, you know, they're great indicators of prairie health, but you know, birds can get up and move around. But as we're losing more and more grasslands, having these great sparrows out there that rely on the invertebrate community so much, they're really closely tied to that other aspect of a healthy prairie, which is that a good, strong invertebrate community based on the other aspects going all the way down to the soil. But these guys are really good conspicuous indicators to look for. And it's always good to see them out there in the prairie.
Thanks, Heath. Here's a completely non-scientific term that I personally like and wanted to throw into this presentation, the borderlands. So a way to say that might be ecotone. It's essentially the gradation between a couple different habitat types. So in this case, what I'm referring to by the borderlands is basically the interface between open areas, whether that's our native prairies, it can be old fields. In some cases, with some of our species, it can even be, you know, more of a bare ground or short grass, maybe grazed type of habitat. Between all of that sort of open country and a more shrubby, thick vegetation type moving up towards woodland edge. And so these four sparrows that are pictured here are kind of in that ecotone, that border region in terms of habitat. They're not prairie obligates, although to some degree or another, they will use, you know, prairie or prairie edge habitat, but they're really sort of more shrub and thicket species. So of these four species pictured here, a couple of them are here in the winter. And
Can you go back a slide, Dana, real quickly?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Carol,
Sorry.
I did see that in the messages as well. I was sort of waiting for Dana here, but I know that some people have smaller screens, and so we'll make sure we say the names of these birds here. The first slide that we're looking at, we had the Henslow and grasshopper sparrows, those Amadrama sparrows there, the one before this slide. And then here we have the eastern towhee on the left. The next one over to the right is the field sparrow. The one in the upper right is the chipping sparrow, and the one in the lower right is the song sparrow. So just so you know.
Thanks to both Ethan and Carol. I can open up the chat, but then it'll start forwarding my slides in a not useful way. So so of those four, the couple that are here during the winter are song sparrow. And we're going to talk a little bit more about ID of the song sparrow later in comparison with another bird that it is easily confused with. But here's our song sparrow, so called because of its wonderful song, although a lot of the sparrows do have melodious songs as well. And then our field sparrow. So this field sparrow is, I think, a very interestingly named bird. It certainly is a bird that's associated with fields and open habitats, but within that more open prairie or grassland matrix, this bird nests and spends most of its time in shrubby areas and thicker areas. So I would almost call it a prairie shrub sparrow or something along those lines, maybe not so much a field sparrow. Just to touch on a couple species that migrate through Missouri, they neither breed nor winter here. But again, the habitats that are out there that people provide, especially the well-managed habitats, such as our native prairies, are really, really important habitat for these stopover migrants as well. they provide them with absolutely necessary resources. And Ethan and I, and maybe some folks that are on this webinar today, have been at talks where ecologists will talk about habitat quality in terms of a fire escape, and then sort of a motel situation, and then a full service hotel. So it's giving a human spin to the way that birds look at habitat. But a fire escape might be a tiny patch of city park in the midst of otherwise developed areas, for example. And a full service hotel would be something that really provides the food, high quality food, the shelter, water sources that a bird would really need during migration. And so a well-managed prairie is a full service hotel for these birds. And so a little bit closer look at these two little ones. So here's a bird called the clay-colored sparrow. And for me, the best ID feature for me personally on this bird is this gray collar that you can see here. We have a non-streaky front, right, and a very streaky head. And then that gray collar, I think, really stands out. And Lincoln sparrow. I love Lincoln sparrows. They're probably my favorite sparrow. And this is a species, well, actually both of them, that will sometimes treat us to their song when they're coming through on migration. So you can see the really, really fine ornate streaking on the breast and sides of the Lincoln sparrow there. We've got a bit of a streaky head here, right? Look at this, you know, once you get the close-up look, it's a very, very distinctive head pattern and very distinctive streaking as well.
You know, as Dana mentioned, we won't go too much into it, but it's important to know these are pretty well-defined areas, like a malar area, or you know, people will refer to these as an eye line or an eye ring. And the stripe or streakiness on the head, there'll be a lot of different types of stripes. So there might be just a median crown stripe, or there might be two different stripes up there, but they're always placed in the same spot. So you can get familiar with birds that exhibit those particular areas well, and then you'll be able to cover your bases across all the sparrows.
Oh, little addition of picture there. So sometimes the species acts in a wren-like way. Folks are probably familiar with some of the wrens and how they kind of stick their tail up in the air and hop around in that way. The Lincoln sparrow will do that as well. So kind of narrowing it down to winter sparrows particularly right now. Here are 4 species that are going to be your best bets for what you can see in your own backyard. And of course, this varies by where you live. And we'll get into a little bit of birds that are probably not in your backyard. But of the sparrow species, particularly the white-crowned sparrow, which is this bird here on the upper left, the dark-eyed junco on the lower left, and the white-throated sparrow on the lower right, are really the most common backyard sparrows that will come to feeders. And then here in the upper right is the fox sparrow, and they will as well. They're certainly seen in backyards. They're not quite as common of a species as the other 3 that are pictured here. So let's take a closer look at these birds. So both of these are white-crowned sparrows. The bird on the left is an older bird. So basically, the white-crowned sparrow is here in Missouri only during the winter. During the first winter of their life, so the year, you know, their hatch year, and then into January, February, March, they're going to look like the bird on the right. So that is a white-crowned sparrow first winter. It has nothing to do with the sex of the bird. It is simply due to age. And then after after their first year of life, they will molt into this adult plumage that you can see on the left with the really, really striking black and white emphatically striped head pattern. So that was the second bird that we heard earlier when we did not have the pictures up. White-crowned sparrow.
Very similar to the other bird, except for it's more buzzy. Has that buzzy end, goes sort of buzzes.
And I'll just give it away. We're going to play it again. But that first song that y'all heard in the first slide is this bird, the white-throated sparrow. So as Eth just described, they both start off with that whistle, but you'll hear, I'm going to play it again here, the white-throated sparrow continues with that whistly tone, whereas the white-crowned sparrow that we just heard has a couple more melodic whistles and then gets very buzzy in the song. So here we have our white-throated sparrow. And there are different morphs. There's two different morphs of the white-throated sparrow. The white striped form that you can see on the left-hand side, upper and lower left. And then you can see the tan striped form there on the upper right. So you can see the difference in, mostly it's the head pattern. And then you can see it's sort of a little bit, I don't mean to be mean, but a little bit dingier there on the throat of the tan form. And Eth, do you want to tell them about the mating system of this bird? Because I think it's really interesting, because this too is not a male-female coloration. It's two different morphs.
As far as I know, through our general field of biology, they're very unique in this particular mechanism, and it does boil down to some genetic sort of thing. But the white males prefer the tan striped females, and the tan striped males prefer the white striped females. And there's been oodles of studies on these, on behaviors related to that behavioral characteristic or that selection characteristic. And what they've found more and more interesting things out of it. Basically, the white striped males are pretty mean and aggressive, and they sort of outcompete. But there was some new finding recently that they found that some of the tan striped females do something different, I think, than what they anticipated. Did you read that as well, Dana?
I think it's actually the white striped females.
Okay.
And it's that they are also quite aggressive and territorial. And then the tan striped males and females are not quite as aggressive, and they're more conscientious, if you will, parents. But as you kind of mentioned, they get out competed because the white striped form is so aggressive. So they kind of try to pair up with the opposite so that they can have the good characteristics or the positive reproductive strategies of both forms.
Yeah, it's very kind of worthwhile to look into if you can dig up papers on white-throated sparrows. I think there's one titled something like Mafia Wars or something, where they, it's pretty entertaining for sparrow geeks.
So I think that's the one that most folks said they had heard. So old Sam Peabody. or oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada. Okay, so here is our fox sparrow, a little bit more of a close-up of this particular bird. This is a relatively very large sparrow. So it is noticeable, particularly if you can get a glimpse of this bird foraging around other sparrows, you will notice a relatively extreme size difference. And you can see that tawny, red fox coloration that this bird has, and particularly here in the Midwest. Here's a well-known favorite. This is a bird that a lot of folks call snowbird, for pretty obvious reasons. And you can see we have the dark-eyed junco male on the left. There are a number of subspecies of this bird, the dark-eyed junco. The one that's most common here is the slate-colored, and you can see the male there on the left. In the upper right, the female, and then down on the lower right, we have put the Oregon form, which you can see that really distinctive hood. And this is a subspecies that we get here in Missouri somewhat frequently. They can be, there's a lot of individual variation in this species, so it can be really, really, really difficult actually to say, yes, that's definitely an Oregon junco. But it's wonderful to watch, a flock of juncos at your feeder, or wherever, and be able to see that individual variation. There's some individuals for which, when we very occasionally band birds at feeders, catch them and band them, it's actually very, very difficult to tell the sexes apart, because there's a lot of individual variation and coloration, and that's sort of exacerbated by their age and what stage of plumage they're in.
They recently came up with a new subspecies of them as well. So if you're not already baffled by pink-sided or white-winged or Oregon versus slate-colored, they now have I think a cismontanus or something like that. And so they are fascinating to get into if you're looking for those subtle details. And of course, they all have different breeding range, but they may converge, and we get to see them here on their wintering grounds. So they're pretty neat birds.
To that end, what you just mentioned, Eth, about the different subspecies, I have been warned by a good friend on the Missouri Bird Records Committee that it's very, very difficult to definitively tell different subspecies. It's fun to do in sort of a hobby way, but when it comes to like really accurately documenting them and their occurrence in Missouri, it's pretty challenging.
Yeah,
so don't worry too much about it.
If you're going to be that much of a geek, then you can really start getting competitive about those sort of things. And I guess the most accurate way would you'd have to have them in hand, and maybe go by measurements and look at specific feather tracks for things like white-winged and that. But just being able to see those, you can see a lot of that variation just looking at them underneath your feeders or out in the field, and you can get a sense for, imagine all of those different varieties sort of spread out across their breeding ranges, and you can really see that sort of the diversity within species across the range, which is I think is one of the coolest things about birds, and one of the best measures of any good health of anything is seeing that diversity, even with down into species, but within species.
Thank you. And sparrows is one of the guilds that is the most interesting to see that in. Okay, so we're finally to the birds that you might have to go further afield, if you will, to be able to see them. But it occurred to me when we were putting these slides together that this is a Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, and the folks that I've been around from the Missouri Prairie Foundation tend to have a lot of native plants in their lives. I've met several that live right next to a prairie. So I'm not going to go ahead and necessarily assume that these species will not be in your backyard. They might be. They are not in our backyard, with one exception. But we have here, starting on the upper left and going clockwise, we have the swamp sparrow, the Savannah sparrow, the LeConte sparrow, the Harris's sparrow, and the American tree sparrow. And we're just going to take a quick look. We do definitely want to leave time for some questions. So we'll just take a kind of quick look at each of these species. So here's the Savannah sparrow. This is a bird that can be really quite common here in Missouri in both winter and migration. The swamp sparrow. Now this is one that for me can be really difficult to get eyes on. So these are some really nice pictures by some folks we know, and they will do this for you occasionally, but a lot of times they're going to be skulking around quite a lot. As their name would imply, they inhabit wetter areas, literally wetlands or wet areas of prairies is where they are the most common. LeConte sparrow is not a very common species. There are some prairies in Missouri where they're fairly reliably seen during the late fall and winter. But you can see that honestly, I mean, I just find this bird to be just absolutely beautiful. This picture is not a misrepresentation of how they look. They almost glow. Their plumage glows. This is a prairie obligate bird. The population of the LeConte sparrow is not terribly high, and so our existing prairies, particularly native prairies, are really, really important for this species.
I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 80,000 individuals estimated in their North American population. And what's really neat about that is, since I think of them as kind of a northern Henslow sparrow, because they appreciate that same type of vegetative structure. So when the Henslow sparrows piece out of your prairies in Missouri, you can step in the wintertime, and those areas where the Henslows like to be, you can find the LeContes. That's how I think of them.
Yes, at this moment, I would actually just like to really briefly acknowledge Brad Jacobs, the former state ornithologist who left us this year. He is the person that showed me personally my very first LeConte sparrow. An American tree sparrow. So this is another one that sort of belongs in that birds of the borderlands category in terms of habitat. They are here in winter. The bird that you would be most likely to get them confused with would be the chipping sparrow. And there's a little bit of overlap as chipping sparrows are moving south after breeding here in Missouri, whereas and tree sparrows are coming down for the winter. But they really do not overlap that much in terms of seasonality. So both of them have this red cap. But for instance, our chipping sparrow does not have Harris just wanted to jump in there. Chipping sparrow does not have this dot right here on the chest. They also have different color bills. Chipping sparrows is completely black. An American tree sparrow, you can see here, is bicolored. You can see it on both actually. And then the line, you can see this sort of this eye line, if you will, is black in the chipping sparrow. And so it's a good example of one that it will help you to check out range maps and seasonality should you have a question. The American tree sparrow is one that has a little bit of a misleading name as well. They certainly will roost in trees, but they're very much an open country bird. So again, that sort of interface between our prairies and old fields and more shrubby habitats, and then sort of a forest edge as well. and our Harris sparrow. This is a handsome bird. Whether they're male or female, because you can't tell in this species, as is true for most sparrows. So this is a bird that breeds in the very, very far north tundra. I believe, Eth, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the very last North American bird that ever had its nest found by ornithologists. Is that true?
That's correct. And if you're a real geek, you'll know that they're oologists, right? Oologists, those that study eggs and collect eggs. Also, are great friends and partners at the Audubon chapter, which is out of the greater Kansas City area. It's Burroughs Audubon, and their logo has the Harris's sparrow on it because it's one of the 3 birds that was actually discovered here in Missouri, and it was quite near Kansas City. It was actually called the mourning finch back then.
So just a brief note on ID. These are a couple of species, and I know that if you're just starting off with sparrows, as some folks on this webinar might be, when I say these are 2 species that are often confused, you might be thinking there's a bunch of them that I confuse. And I've totally been there. Absolutely. I think the best advice that we can give as far as really getting your sparrow ID down is just really being patient and getting, trying to get those close looks at all these different, small but ornate and sometimes remarkably different, once you get the close look field marks that we've been talking about, and just, enjoy it. Don't get frustrated by it. So these 2 species occupy pretty similar habitat, particularly in the winter. The song sparrow really tends towards more shrubs and small trees, whereas the Savannah sparrow, I'm certainly used to seeing more in an open grass habitat. But you can see that they're both very, very streaky. They're sort of, if you will, microhabitat preferences do sometimes overlap. So you can find them in the same places. A couple of things that I've noticed personally is that there can be 1 or 2 individual song sparrows amongst a group of Savannah sparrows and other species. There's typically more Savannah sparrows flocking together than song sparrows flocking together. But you can see, again, check out the beak. They have different colored beaks. The Savannah sparrows has that light pink bone color, and the song sparrows is much, much darker. So for one thing, if you get a look at this yellow lore, we call it, little between the eye and the beak area there, that's a really good ID feature for Savannah sparrow. Song sparrow is never going to have that yellow lore. That's sometimes difficult to see, and there's some individual variation in how much yellow a Savannah sparrow will have, but that's a great feature that'll sort of clinch it for you if you see these.
I don't want to dwell on the vocalizations as you mentioned, but the Latin for the song sparrow is melodious, and they are very melodious. I mean, they're just great songs. They're very enjoyable to listen to. And the Savannah sparrow is similar, but it says its name. It goes, this is Savannah sparrow. So.
Okay, last but absolutely not least, we wanted to just give a mention of conservation, which to us is of utmost and primary importance. This is Missouri Prairie Foundation's La Petite Gemme Prairie. And so, as we've talked a little bit about throughout, providing habitat for these birds and all other birds is really, really important. And we do thank MPF and its partners for doing that. A couple of things that we wanted to mention that you personally can do on more of an individual basis, because if you're like us, you're not an owner of a couple hundred acres of native prairie. there's some small things you can do. So even just in your own backyard, quite a few of these species will come to feeders, and particularly in our coldest periods of time where there's a lot of snow cover that might be on the ground, sort of hiding existing food, providing, just some sunflower seed, some water that hasn't frozen, and then some shelter, whether that's, a brush pile in a small backyard, or if you have, some acreage to manage to provide birds with good native plant habitat. Reduce window strikes. This is something that you can do on your own home using either decals, or you can make sure, the simplest thing to do maybe is make sure that at least at certain times of day, you're putting some sort of covering over. We run a project that investigates bird collisions with windows in the Kansas City area. And unfortunately, we find a lot of sparrows, a lot. So this is something that can really help sparrows and all other birds, is if you reduce window strikes on your own home. And finally, we know you've heard this before, but this is huge. If there's one thing that we as bird conservationists would ask that people do, it's to keep their cats indoors. Cats are the biggest cause of direct mortality by far on birds in North America. And with that, hopefully, Brooke and Carol, we didn't go too much over time. We'd be super happy to take any questions.
I saw a few piling in there.
I see a smiley face from Colleen Crank. Hello, Colleen. Let's see. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
I saw a comment on some of the photos there. Some of them from MRBO staff, but many of those photos are entries into our annual photo contest that we do. And some of them were winners. Some of them were not winners, but we love them so much. We often put them even in our publications and things. So yeah, big shout out to those people in our photo contest.
Thank you, Dana. Ethan, this is Carol David with the Prairie.
Here she is.
Can you hear me okay? Sorry about that.
Yep.
We have a number of questions, and there were a couple questions at least about when you were speaking about borderland birds. And did you mean that these are edge species?
Correct.
Okay. And someone asked a question related. Oh, Ethan is.
Well,
does that mean edge, or does it?
edge is a thing, but and as we evolve in our understanding of habitat and grassland habitat in particular, you can almost take whatever you think of as that kind of short shrubby edge and intersperse that, especially throughout draws and things in a prairie that's got that good heterogeneity. And you can think of that edge out there. So I guess not necessarily in the classic sense of edge, but the edge within the field. That makes sense.
Yes. A similar question. Carolyn says, I have a very wide power line easement, and that's where I usually hear the field sparrow. Would these easements be considered borderlands?
It sort of depends on what is around it, but probably yes. I know that the one that we have and many of the ones I see are often grassland of some sort, and there has been a pretty big effort to restore native plants to a lot of power line right-of-ways, which is awesome. A lot of times I feel that there's sort of the strip of the power line right-of-way, and often people have hedgerows on either side. So yeah, it's saying something's borderlands or even edge is not it's more of a aesthetically descriptive term than a scientific term. But it's basically, where two different habitat types come together, or more, maybe more, but at least two different habitat types come together. So in some cases, say you've got a power line right away that is restored to native prairie, it might be good for particularly wintering prairie birds most power line right of ways that I've ever seen, I'm trying to think of an exception, are really too narrow probably to provide the breeding territory with enough habitat for breeding birds in most cases, if
for
they
grassland.
are bordered, right, if they are bordered by trees or shrubs. So
For grassland obligates, you're talking.
correct, for grassland obligates, for prairie obligate birds. So a lot of our bird species, sparrows and others, they can be obligate, meaning they just really want that one thing, you know, like a Henslow sparrow that we talked about at the very beginning, or a grasshopper sparrow, they need prairie. They're not going to go breed in a forest. They're not even really going to migrate through a forest or winter in a forest. They must have that habitat type. Are the birds that are a little less picky, if you will, they're more habitat generalist than habitat specialists, often sort of exist in that open habitat to shrubby area that we're talking about.
Great, thanks. Question from Dan. The towhee is considered a sparrow, and why?
Yes, yes,
Because
it is in the sparrow family.
Could you just real briefly explain why taxonomically it's considered a sparrow?
the reason why it stands out as being almost unsparrow-like is because of its size. It's probably the most primitive of our sparrows, and that's why when you flip it open your field guide, it'll be like the first one in there. So it's just like anything with plant communities. We've determined through genetics. I haven't done any genetic studies, but people that study the genetics have determined the closeness and relationships of birds. In fact, any good field guide is going to be put together taxonomically. So you start with kind of your more primitive birds and work towards your more recently evolved birds. So
Thank you. Stephen asks, any specific native plants you recommend to attract a wide variety of sparrows to my yard? I live on about an acre in Kansas City, and I'm currently working on converting 2,000 square feet of lawn to native grasses and wildflowers.
Hi, Steve. Yeah, I Prairie Foundation will give you the best probably options directing you towards what plants to plant, because if you put in good native plants and a variety of them that fruit and seed throughout the year, so you have a kind of a year-long availability of not only the food but the seed food, but the invertebrates, and going all the way into providing good cover year round. If you can develop a composition of that, that'll be the best. And that's we got our beauty berries, still got really good berries on them right now. I'm waiting for that mockingbird to come down and start eating some. It's pretty exciting.
And Ethan, if I could just add too, I would say it's not just the native plants, but how to manage them. In other words, leaving the vegetation standing in the
Yes.
winter where you feel that's desired, so that we have those seed sources or fruit sources and cover in the winter as well. And we, for example, leave the leaves. And we have a Grow Native Garden sign called Leave the Leaves. You can put it up in your garden and help people see why you are managing your native landscape the way you are. We also have other, yes. So thank you for that.
That's very, thank you for that. That's crucial. Yeah, we want to manicure everything to death, but it's.
I just want to add bunch grasses to that for sparrows specifically. If there's a way that you can intersperse, and as Carol just mentioned, leaving them for cover throughout the winter. I know that the bunch grasses that we have really, so your little blue stems and native prairie grasses, i.e. those that don't create a mat situation like fescue, those harbor a ton of sparrows for us.
Yeah, you're not being lazy by not raking up your leaves all the way. You're just being you're a provider.
Great, wonderful, thank you. And next question from David. do white and tan striped birds occur in mixed flocks? And here I think he means the white and tan stripe of which species was it that you spoke of earlier? Of the
White-throated sparrow.
the
Right,
white-throated. So,
white-throated sparrow. Yep. And the answer is yes, absolutely.
okay, so mixed
Good
flocks.
question. Nice
Great.
question.
And then Melanie asks, I think also in regard to the same species, what's the selective function, do you think?
So that's a great question and fun. So the different sort of parenting styles and resource providing styles of the two morphs of white-throated sparrows means that they will do better if it's almost like to again sort of humanize it. It's like opposites attract, and when the white and tan morphs with their slightly different behaviors, such as the white morph being more aggressive and more territorial, and the tan morph being a more caretaking parent that's that pays, that's more attentive to the nest and nestlings. If you put those two things together, you're going to have better nesting success. So
It's a great topic. Just it's hard to predict functions of behavior. Like you can say, okay, we know that birds sing because they're going to be doing vocal performance to both attract mates and to defend their territory. We know that that's a thing, right? But it's really hard to elicit what is that particular purpose and function of that. So it's a slippery slope, because as good scientists, we're not going to say, hey, we know what that is for. We can sort of assume through these behavioral connections and through a bunch of studies, we can start to see, oh, maybe these particular males with this characteristic are better fathers, or these particular ones with a better singing voice may be able to hold a territory better and better quality habitat, or these ones are just really good at feeding and caring for the young, kind of thing. Those 2 or 3 different characteristics are usually drivers, but it's always the female that's doing the selecting of it. So it's good to keep those things in mind, but I don't think we have 100% answers on the functions of those behaviors.
Oh, more to learn. Another question here. We have quite a few more questions if you're willing to keep going here, Dana and Ethan.
absolutely. Happy to.
Are cats that have been declawed a serious problem outdoors?
That is another good question. Unfortunately, the answer is yes, because just think about cats' hunting behavior and how they'll sort of hold something down and then they can get at it with their teeth, basically. And it's just it's purely a situation of the fact that they're non-native. They were introduced, they're originally from the Middle East, and obviously humans have brought them all over the world as domesticated pets, but their non-native status means that really all of our native critters, just like, they really don't know how to deal with them. Plus there are a lot out there, and so they do a lot of damage.
2 quick points, because not all cats are bad. The dog is man's best friend, cat's man's adorable little serial killer, but they're not bad. But their life expectancy is halved if they're outdoors. And also, if there's a combination of them being declawed and outdoors, they're not quite they don't have the defenses that they normally would have out there too. So I think all in all, it's good to just keep them indoors. People build cat habitats and things that I forget what they call them, but they're outdoor things where they can actually get out and have their own space and everything, where they're not killing stuff.
Thank you. There was a question, was the house sparrow the only non-native sparrow? And then there was another comment about the Eurasian sparrow around St. Louis. So could you speak about those 2 points?
Sure. Well, one question answered the other question, basically. So that's great. And I honestly, I have such limited experience with the Eurasian tree sparrow that I might have forgotten about it and said, no, the house sparrow is the only non-native sparrow. But yes, there is that small population over in the St. Louis area.
And then, but apart from the house sparrow and the Eurasian tree sparrow, all the ones you spoke of are native. Of course.
Correct.
Yes. Okay,
Correct.
great, thank you. Are there any data showing impacts of climate change on sparrow populations?
How long do we have, Carol? That's an incredibly complicated question with a lot of answers. Honestly, I think the best resource that I know of is Tom Bonneau's lab at the University of Missouri at Columbia that is doing a lot of extensive studies on birds in general. I believe that a fair amount of his work is focused on forest birds such as wood thrush. But yes, there are data out there. I do want to just really briefly talk about, I mean, one thing where this is an indirect effect that there are quite a lot of data on, but one of the things is, particularly with prairie species, because of the increasing temperatures, extremely variable but increasing rainfall, and then the additional carbon dioxide that is in the air, prairie managers are having a hard time keeping things prairie in a lot of cases. And I'm speaking regionally, not just Missouri, but our woody growth that has become even more prolific due to climate change, I find very alarming in terms of prairie birds, because even as Ethan mentioned, the Henslow sparrow, for instance, likes, thicker grass and forbs habitat, but there's a point at which it gets too shrubby and too woody for even a Henslow sparrow. And at that point, it's way too shrubby and woody for a grasshopper sparrow. So I think that in addition to like a bunch of other things that we could get into about migration timing and matching up with prey and plant, blooming and seeding times, that's something that I find really concerning, because that is already happening. Like, it's harder even to manage habitat than it typically is, which is very difficult to begin with.
Yeah, I think since it is such a big topic and we have a bunch of other questions, what we'll do, Brooke will send an email to all the registrants tomorrow, and we can put in the information about the research you mentioned at MU. And we'll also put in a link to a Missouri Prairie Foundation journal article about climate change and its impacts on increased shrubbiness. So moving on to some more questions, and here's a couple questions about management of grasslands. When's the best time to do a burn with birds in mind? And if you're going to wait to mow a field in winter, when is it okay to mow?
Big things I think of there is we used to say, hey, you're okay after this point, and like 15th of July, it's the magic date. And we're finding a lot of birds are still out there breeding and nesting much later. So the longest you can put off mowing, the better. And the other big thing is like, in any consideration of just, if you're just managing for a prairie or grassland, just don't do it all at once. Just kind of break it up in chunks. Those are a couple of the big things. And if you do have to mow when it's on the edge of those breeding seasons, just make sure you have flushing bars and have a good mow technique.
Great. And let's see here. Actually, I think we did get quite a few questions answered. Here's a question from Laura. A white-throated sparrow hit our window and I thought it was dead. Minutes later, it sat up and remained motionless for 2 hours before flying away. Is he all right? So a lot of people may have those questions when they see birds hit with window strikes. Maybe you could comment a bit about that.
Yes. So in that particular situation, and that is fairly common, we're not going to be able to know. I guess the real answer is I hope so. My understanding from birds that are that folks find that way and then they take them to a rehabber, such as Lakeside in Kansas City. Some proportion of them do end up dying within a couple days, and that would be the only way we'd know that, right? Because once the bird flies away, we're not going to be able to follow its fate. But that's certainly, the bird certainly has far more of a chance, obviously, than if it had perished upon hitting the window. So it of course depends on how hard and at what angle it hit. It could just be a little bit stunned, and as you would have witnessed, fly off and eventually be fine. I really don't remember what the percentages that I've heard from folks at, say, Lakeside. If anybody knows that's on this, please put it in the chat. But it's obviously hard to study, but it's certainly a better outcome than it could have been. So
Yeah, and I guess it just underscores the importance of putting up those decals or glass, bird-friendly glass, other things to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Yeah, the closer you have good like native plant cover, the better too, especially near the area where you're feeding them. Because as soon as a predator comes in, that's often what happens to people. A predator comes in, they don't have any place, any good cover to escape to. So they're just trying to get out of there as fast as they can, and they just run into the windows. And that's when they get some of the hardest window strikes too. And
That's a very good point, because we often, of course, put bird feeders where we can see them and enjoy them, which is near a window. So yeah, that should be a great challenge, is to find a location for our feeders where we can enjoy them, but they have non-fatal escape routes.
Carol, we'll send links to particularly the American Bird Conservancy. I think has the most comprehensive webpage on this topic. And it has a little bit about the causes and just things you can do. We'll send it to y'all so that you can send it to attendees in the follow-up email.
I'll note too, if anybody is in St. Louis, at the St. Louis Zoo, the candy shop, I just happen to be in there, has bird-friendly glass. And so that's a cool place to see bird-friendly glass in the St. Louis area. There may be many other places as well, but that's one place you can see it. Just a couple of other questions here. Sarah Kendrick asks, how do you suggest that birders best practice their sparrows? So you did a wonderful job in your presentation of really kind of narrowing down by habitat and season the number of sparrows that a person might see. So, but it still can be very, pretty difficult, especially for beginners. Do you have any tips on how to practice identifying the sparrows that you presented today?
I would start off by saying that this is the perfect season to do it. Winter is the best. For beginner birders, I would never be like, no, go on a bird walk in May or something, because that's spring is exciting and it's wonderful. But for one thing, there's a lot of vegetation, so that makes things difficult. For if folks are just starting off, honestly, I think the best thing you can do is grab a pair of binoculars, sit by your window and watch birds at your feeder and watch sparrows beneath your feeder, because you'll have an unobstructed view. Unless, as Ethan just mentioned, a predator comes in and they scatter, you're going to be able to just sit and really look at them and get good views and watch their behavior for as long as you need to really start getting better. And then after that, I would advise you can just go to a local park once you feel you've kind of have got a little bit more of a feel for sparrows, and look around for sparrows there. In hopefully soon, go on a socially distanced field trip with other birders. I know, Carol, you brought up St. Louis. St. Louis Audubon does trips. Everybody has sort of suspended trips right now, but they'll be back soon, I'm sure. Missouri Birding Society does some field trips, and I always found it I still find it really, really nice to go with other people that know their birds, and then they can point out birds to you and say, this is a fox sparrow and this is why I know that. If you looked like you were gonna.
Well, I just think it's funny that you did a small, slight plug there for the Missouri Birding Society since you're the president of it. Um, uh, Also, the Missouri Birding Society has a MoBirds listserv, and it's just an email listserv, and people report their sightings across the state, and they have forever. And a lot of times, people will report like the common birds that they're seeing, or the first time these ones show up, and it helps you keep a feel of what's kind of going on, the kind of a pulse of what's going on around the state.
I'll just add too that I think what has really helped me learn birds is is process of elimination by habitat. So if I'm in a bottomland forest, there's a certain suite of birds I'm most likely to see. If I'm on a prairie or other native grassland, there's a certain suite of species or if I'm in a neighborhood. So those things have helped me, but of course, they're not absolutes, and it depends on where your neighborhood is. For example, your neighborhood, like you said, might be near an open grassland, or it might be in a very urbanized area. Another question here, and is how do we encourage more students to be involved in bird watching, bird conservation? And I know you both have, through Missouri River Bird Observatory, developed the Young Birders Club. And you might want to speak about that and the question in general. And then I also wanted to call on Brooke Widmar with MPF, because she has some great ideas about this as well. But Ethan and Dana, could you address that first?
Well, we did spearhead the Missouri Young Birders Club. It's based on a model out of Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the Black Swamp Bird Observatory, where they had a group of young kids that wanted to pioneer it, kind of that took the reins of it, and they were just facilitated by the adults. And I think that was key to it, getting these kids out there and enjoying it, is letting them take ownership of it, let them sort of decide where they want to go, let them have fun with it, make sure it's a fun experience for them, and provide them with opportunities. Yeah, it helps to have good binoculars. It helps to have somebody that's knowledgeable but not overbearing. All those things come together, and I think through the Missouri Young Birders Club, which is coordinated by our educator Paige, and she's working a lot like in Kansas City. That's the Burroughs Audubon, and Sarah Shield. She's been helping coordinate things there. We had different people in different areas of the state sort of can take ownership and coordinate it, and try to get field trips out there and opportunities for kids. I'm not sure what Brooke has to add, but I'm sure it's brilliant. Dana too.
Ethan, you're right on there on some of the tips. I'm in Columbia now, but I was lucky enough to grow up in Springfield, where our local Audubon, Greater Ozarks Audubon Society, has great outreach for students, and specifically a high school program called Glade. But really, it's about those organizations. Kind of what Ethan was saying was making sure there's opportunities for the students out there. So this Young Birders group is really great to have in the state of Missouri, and active there in the Kansas City area, hopefully going to be active in the Columbia area, and in the Springfield area. That group has a lot of young people involved, a lot of young people engaged in their group, just because they've put the work in to give opportunities to students. So got to meet them where they're at, because they might not just show up on their own. There needs to be a little effort there. So that's great that you guys are putting that together, and Paige is putting that together with that statewide group.
I'd like to just add too, a way that I think we can all be advocates for students learning more about birds is things like walkable neighborhoods, so children can walk to school and observe nature on the way to school, advocating for outdoor classrooms for schools so that children have an opportunity to be outdoors and not just on an asphalt playground. Those are sort of transformative, big picture things, but I think that would address many challenges. And then I'd also say encouraging our higher institutions of learning to continue field-based ecology and a basic, I shouldn't say basic, I should say field study, getting students outdoors, not just in laboratories. Laboratories, of course, that's extremely important, but I think we can all be advocates for our tax-supported educational systems to always include outdoor outdoor education. So that I think simply having more time to observe nature, whether it be in our backyard or a walk to the school, we build that repetition, we build that familiarity with nature, we build that familiarity with the birds that we see as we walk to school.
Carol, I loved that comment. Thank
Yep.
you.
It's
But everybody, you know, participating, we still have 96 people on. I think feel the same way, and so we can all be advocates. I will also add that folks of all ages, of course, are welcome anytime on Missouri Prairie Foundation prairies to observe prairies. In fact, there was a comment here from someone who said she saw 2 LeConte sparrows at La Petite Gem Prairie in September. So that's a
Hooray. Nice.
yeah, so that's really cool. So I just wanted to mention that, but I do agree, having someone with you, that's how I learned. I mean, I had the great Jim Jackson in Washington, Missouri, who he's how I learned the call for wide-eyed vireo, you know. And so we have those people in our lives, like you said, Dana, that about how Brad Jacobs showed you your first, was it LeConte's? Did you say?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we have those people in our lives that guide us into the world of birds, and that's really wonderful. I think I've addressed all of the questions.
Hey, Carol, I saw a couple really brief ones in the Q&A that we can address really quickly.
I thought that I thought I had addressed those, but let's see here. You talked about the sparrow, the edge
So way back at the top, there was a question about field guide.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a field guide. This is a personal preference thing, but my own personal preference is Sibley. But the one thing I will say that is really more of a blanket recommendation, because there are a lot of good field guides out there, is get one with drawings, not photographs. I know that a lot of the beginners books are typically they use photographs, and the problem with that is that you're going to have like a snapshot in time of like a particular individual bird in a particular light, right? Depending on the time of day the photograph was taken. Whereas a field guide that uses drawings are artists' compositions of the important field markers on these birds. And they, Sibley is good, Nat Geo is good, the new Petersons are good. And they'll show, a little bit of a variety of plumages, but they strive for accuracy, and they get it in a way that a lot of photographs will not. Photographs are awesome we just use them to show like up close and the real individual beauty of birds, but when it comes to ID, I would just highly recommend one with pictures and range maps right next to the pictures.
Excellent advice.
I saw a question from Steve there. Why do I rarely see house sparrows on prairies? And basic short answer to that is,
Awesome
well,
question.
on our little restored area, we see them every now and then, but not very far out there. But they're a cavity nester and a cavity rooster. And so you rarely have those large diameter trees in that state of decay, and they don't like to fly that far out in the open. So like when we station our bluebird houses, we try to keep them just out of house sparrow range, because they'll go in there and they'll take it over. They'll take out eggs. I've even had them kill my bluebirds in the wintertime. So they're not an open country bird. They're a cavity bird.
Thank you. I'm sorry I overlooked that question. I think we've addressed everything. And as we mentioned before, we will get an email out tomorrow with to all the registrants with a link to the recording and some of the resources that were shared today. And thank you all very much for tuning in. And thank you very much, Dana and Ethan, Missouri River Bird Observatory, for this wonderful webinar.
Thanks for having us, MPF, and thanks everybody for sticking with us for so long.
Everybody. Sparrows are awesome. They are.
Birds are awesome.
Birds
Thanks,
are.
everyone. Have a good night.